There's a version of you that you know exists. Focused, consistent, following through on things that actually matter to you. You've seen it, maybe in short bursts, maybe years ago, maybe just kind of occasionally when everything seems to line up and you think, well, this is brilliant, this is what I'm capable of. But then it fades. The energy drops, the focus blurs, you start something and somewhere along the line, without quite knowing why or how, you just stop, you know? Now, if you've spent any time telling yourself that that's a discipline problem, that if you just wanted it badly enough or tried harder or found the right system, you'd be able to sustain it. I want to offer you a different explanation because I spent years thinking exactly that and I was wrong. It's not a discipline problem, it's a physiology problem. And understanding that distinction changed everything for me. Over the course of my 30s, I started several businesses. I started one's called Boostery London, which was a website for things to do in London that didn't involve getting drunk. There was the Beardy PT, which was an online personal training business, years before online coaching was really even a thing. And there was Outliers Wellbeing, which was a corporate wellbeing company that became a B Corp, had several members of staff, and some really genuinely impressive clients. None of them reach their potential. And for a long time, I thought I knew why. I thought I wasn't disciplined enough, I wasn't smart enough, I had good ideas, but I just wasn't built to see them through. What I didn't understand was that fading wasn't psychological, it was biological. My brain wasn't quitting because I lacked motivation, it was quitting because I wasn't giving it the conditions it needed to perform consistently. This isn't a productivity video, it's not a motivation video. I'm not going to tell you to build better habits or find your why or set bigger goals or any of that kind of stuff. What I want to do is explain what's actually happening physiologically when your brain can't stay in the game and what you can do about it that's practical, evidence-based, and doesn't require you to overhaul your life. Because the gap between what you know you're capable of and what you actually produce consistently, that gap is almost never about character. It's about the biological environment your brain is trying to perform in. And environments can be changed. Your prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain responsible for focus, planning, decision making, and the ability to kind of stay on something long enough to see it through. It's the most recently evolved part of the human brain. And because of that, it's also the most sensitive to its environment. You know, the first thing to lose resources when your body is under stress, under fueled, or poorly rested. Now you think about what that might mean in practical terms. When your blood sugar is unstable, spiking and crashing from a poor breakfast or erratic eating, the prefrontal cortex is the one that takes the hit first. Or when you slept badly for several nights in a row, your executive function, you know, the ability to stay on task, make good decisions, resist distractions, that drops measurably. When your brain is carrying chronic low-grade inflammation from years of eating things that work against it, you know, your brain is operating in a permanently compromised environment. You know, none of that is willpower problem, and none of it is about how much you want something or how serious you are about it. It's about conditions. And for most of my 30s, without realizing it, I was asking my brain to perform in conditions that made sustainable or sustained performance almost impossible. About 5 years ago, I started paying serious attention to the research on how lifestyle factors affect brain performance. Not the supplement heavy end of that kind of discussion, you know, the evidence there is mixed at best, but the fundamentals: exercise, nutrition, and recovery. Understood not as the things you do for your body, but as the things you do to give your brain the physiological conditions it needs to work consistently. Now, I want to walk you through each one, specifically what the science says and what it actually looks like in practice. So let's go with exercise first, because this is where the science is genuinely extraordinary and most people are nowhere near making the most of it. So when you exercise, your muscles release a protein called BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And it promotes the growth of new neurons, strengthens connections between existing ones, and supports the kind of neuroplasticity that makes focused thinking and learning possible. Sometimes called miracle growth of the brain, which is kind of a bit silly description, but it works, you know, it's fairly accurate. And your muscles also release proteins called myokines during exercise, and one in particular is called irisin, and that can cross the blood-brain barrier and act directly on the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is your brain's memory and learning center. And the research here is fascinating because exercise actually stimulates the growth of new neurons in the hippocampus. Now, your brain is physically remodeling itself in response to the load you put on your body. Now, this isn't like fringe science. This is well established, well replicated, and frankly, like brilliant science. But here's the part that most people miss. It's not just whether you exercise, it's when. Now, a 2025 study found that morning exercise produced the strongest improvements in attention, working memory, processing speed, and alertness compared to exercise later in the day. So morning movement aligns with your body's natural cortisol rhythm. You know, cortisol is supposed to peak early in the day to prime your body for alertness and action, and exercise in the morning amplifies that effect. It sets up the neurochemical environment your brain needs to perform for the hours that follow, for the rest of the day. And in practice, this means 20 to 30 minutes of moderate aerobic exercise in the morning. You know, a brisk walk, a run at a pace where you can still hold a conversation, could be cycling, you know, zone 2 intensity, which I covered in last week's video. Now, you're not training for a marathon here, and you're not trying to get super fit. You're creating the conditions in your brain for focused, consistent work. Now, that is a completely different reason to exercise than most people have ever really been given. And in my experience, it's a far more sustainable one. Now, the nutrition piece is where I've seen the fastest and most dramatic changes in the people that I've worked with over the years. Because the brain it's extraordinarily sensitive to what you feed it, and most people are quietly undermining their cognitive performance every single day without even realizing it. Ultra processed food is the biggest culprit. Now, a 2024 study published in Neurology found that higher ultra processed food intake was significantly associated with cognitive impairment. And here's a number that's really quite remarkable. A 10% increase in ultra-processed food consumption, which is roughly like a bag of crisps, produce measurable, statistically significant reductions in cognitive performance. Just one bag of crisps worth. This isn't a distant risk. It's happening right now, this week, this minute, in the brains of people who eat this way. The mechanism is inflammation. Ultra-processed food drives chronic low-grade inflammation throughout the body, and that inflammation reaches the brain and directly impairs how neurons communicate. It produces exactly the flat, foggy, low output feeling that most people put down to kind of tiredness or stress. And blood sugar instability is the other major one. So these high glycemic meals cause rapid spikes in blood glucose, followed by massive crashes that directly impair working memory, concentration, and decision making. So that 3 p.m. wall that a lot of us hit isn't inevitable, you know. Very often it's a blood sugar crash, and it's not a character flaw, you know. Alcohol is definitely worth a mention because the research is really clear, you know, clearer than most people want to acknowledge. But even 2 standard drinks the night before measurably impairs next day performance on attention and executive function tasks, you know, not because you're hungover, because alcohol disrupts neurotransmitter balance and also disrupts sleep architecture in ways that carry into the following day and maybe even the day after that. So what actually helps? Well, protein at every meal is a good place to start. You know, your brain's chemistry, which is kind of dopamine for focus and motivation, serotonin for mood stability, acetylcholine for memory. It's all built from amino acids, and amino acids come from protein. So around 1.5 to 2 grams per kilo of body weight per day keeps the building blocks available consistently. Oily fish twice a week, or a really good quality omega-3 supplement. You know, the EPA and DHA in fish oil are anti-inflammatory and structurally essential for the brain cell membrane. Now, one of the highest leverage dietary changes you can make. And broadly eating a window that aligns with daylight. You know, large meals late in the evening disrupt sleep, elevate the inflammatory markers, and that can all carry into the next day and wipe you out from the morning onwards. Now, I eat ice cream with my kids at the weekend whenever I want to. You know, I'm not describing perfection here. I'm describing the 90%, you know, eating in a way that keeps inflammation low and blood sugar stable most of the time, you know. That produces a noticeable, sustained improvement in how consistent your brain performs. Now, recovery is the one most people think that they understand, and almost nobody is actually doing particularly well. During deep sleep, your brain activates what's called the glymphatic system, which is its own kind of waste clearance mechanism, and it flushes out the metabolic byproducts that accumulate throughout your day, and that includes the proteins associated with long-term cognitive decline. And this process is dramatically impaired by poor sleep, which means that consistently sleeping badly isn't just making you tired. Over time, it's allowing toxic waste. It sounds dramatic, but it's allowing toxic waste to build up in your brain. A single night of poor sleep reduces working memory, decision-making quality, and emotional regulation measurably the following day. The research on this is extremely consistent. There isn't any adaptation to sleep deprivation. You don't toughen up and just get used to it. You just deteriorate more slowly than you might notice. And the part most people get wrong is what happens in the 2 hours before bed. The blue light from screens is a real issue. It suppresses melatonin and delays sleep onset. But the bigger problem is the content. News and emails and social media, anything that triggers a stress or reward response that keeps your nervous system activated regardless of how dim you turn your screen down. And you're not winding down, you're kind of revving up. And the practical fix is simpler than it sounds. Go to bed and wake up at roughly the same time every day. Consistency here is more powerful than any supplement or any kind of sleep gadget that you can think of. And then protect the 2 hours before bed from stimulating content. And at the risk of sounding dramatic, treat poor sleep as a cognitive emergency. It's not a minor inconvenience and you can just push through. It's really disruptive, and your brain's performance tomorrow depends on what you do tonight. Now, I want to be honest about something. I'm not doing anything exceptional, no extreme diets, no particularly complicated training programs, no expensive supplements beyond a few well-evidenced basics like creatine, omega-3, vitamin D, that kind of stuff, nothing exceptional. I just do the fundamentals again and again and again. The same exercise, roughly the same time each morning, food that keeps my brain working rather than fighting it, sleep. I really take that seriously. Now, I'm not particularly remarkable or good at anything, but consistency is my superpower. And the reason I can be consistent now, when I couldn't sustain anything for very long in my 30s, isn't that I found more willpower or better discipline or some productivity hack. It's that I finally gave my brain what it needed to stay in the game. Now, those businesses I started weren't necessarily bad ideas, and the person who couldn't follow through on them wasn't weak or lazy or wasn't trying hard enough. He just didn't figure, or I just didn't figure out yet, that consistency isn't about something that you can force, It's something you create the conditions for. That gap between what you're capable of and what you actually produce, that gap is almost never who you are. It's the conditions you've been working in. And if you want to get a clearer picture of where your own brain performance currently stands, I've put together a free cognitive performance assessment. It's about 3 minutes and it's a genuinely really useful place to start. I'll link it in the description below. And if this kind of thing is really useful to you, subscribing means that you won't miss what's coming up. And now I've got episodes on the hope molecule, on why busy professionals are getting fitter but not thinking more clearly, and a few others I think you'll find really interesting. So see you next week.